So here we'll look at the quadratic formula. And in number 1, we have 3x squared minus 5x minus 9 equals 0. So it is in the correct form of ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So that's important. We find the values for a, b, and c. So a is 3, b is negative 5, and c is negative 9. And then you substitute them into the formula. Okay, so when you do that, there's a substitution step, which you should be able to do at this point. And then when you simplify it, this is where it gets a little bit different. Here we end up with x equals 5, because negative 5 is positive 5, plus or minus the square root of 133 over 6. Now, in this case, notice that the square root of 133, if you're not sure if that simplifies nicely, in your calculator, do square root of 133, press enter, and it just gives you the square root of 133. So it doesn't simplify at all. If you press the double arrow key to get a decimal, it's not a nice decimal, 11.5325. Okay, that is not a nice decimal. So the good news is, it didn't tell us to round this at all. So that is your final answer, because that is the exact form. If you wanted to, you could break it apart into the two different answers, which is x equals 5 plus the square root of 133 over 6, and x equals 5 minus the square root of 133 over 6. You could break it apart like that if you wanted to. But this is a fine exact answer. Now what I will point out is that you can round to the nearest tenth or nearest hundredth if I told you to in the directions. So if you rounded these to the nearest hundredth, you would get 2.76 and negative 1.09. I'll just do one of those in the calculator to show you. So if you do 5 plus the square root of 133, so 5 plus the square root 133, press enter. Okay, always press enter after you put the numerator in, or you have to put it in parentheses. Okay, we don't care what that answer is. Don't worry about that. We have to divide that now, so the answer divided by 6. That gives us this ugly looking answer, which notice is still the exact form. Well now, if I press the double arrow key, we can round it to the correct decimal place. So I did to the nearest hundredth. So the second 5 there will round that first 5 up to a 6. Okay, in a similar case for the x equals negative 1.09. Okay, but again, don't put the decimal values in unless it tells you to round. Okay, so going on to the second one, this one we don't have equal to 0. So get it equal to 0, you can do that a few different ways. You can subtract 2x and add 5 to each side, or you can add 2x squared and subtract 3x from each side. The way I did it on mine was I brought over the 2x minus 5 by subtracting 2x and adding 5. Okay, if you did it the other way, you should say with this, you will still get the same answer at the end, but the work will be a tad different with the signs. Okay, so if you go through and use the quadratic formula to solve it, again, you should be able to do this, so I'm not going to go through every step with you. Pause the video, and I'll put the answer up. Okay, so there's our answer. Our exact form would be this one here, with the square root of 41 in the answer. The square root of 41, not a nice number. Okay, 6 point something. Okay, but if you round it to the nearest hundredth, it'd be these two here. And again, remember that I'm just showing you the nearest hundredth. So if I do ask you to round it, you'll know what the answer should be. But again, the correct answer, because I didn't tell you to round in the directions, would be this one right here. Okay, going on to number 3, I just want to show you these two kind of special cases. So when you have ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, sometimes the b value could be 0 or the c value could be 0. So if we look at part A, x squared minus 9 equals 0. Well, ax squared, we have an a value of 1, and then plus bx, well, there is no x term. So that just means that the b value is 0, and then the c value is negative 9. Okay, and then in part, and I want you to do that one, but I'll mention part B so I can show you the answers all at once. Here, a is 1, b is 6, and then technically this is plus 0 at the end, and then equals 0. So here the c value would be 0. So a is 1, b is 6, and then the c value is 0. Okay, so if you go through and do the quadratic formula on them, this is what you get. And we know that if you were to factor this, that'd be x plus 3x minus 3 to get x equals positive or negative 3 for your answers. Or you could have added 9 and then done the plus or minus square root of 9, and you would get plus or minus 3 for your answers for x. And then in part B, we get 0 and negative 6. Well, we could have factored that to x times x plus 6 equals 0. So you get 0 and negative 6 for your answers. Okay, the last one, this is just one using some decimals. Nothing real tricky there other than using decimals. So go through, pause the video and try that, and I'll put the answer up. Okay, so there's the answer. And again, I just showed you rounding to the nearest hundredth in each of these. Okay, and then on the next page with number 5, solve 3x squared minus 4x plus 5 equals 0. Okay, use the quadratic formula and see what happens. Okay, so again, pause the video and try it. And let's see what happens. Okay, so notice we end up with getting a square root of a negative 44. Well, if you try the square root of negative 44, this says domain error. So your calculator gives you an error. And that goes back to the idea that what do you multiply by itself to get negative 44? Okay, there is nothing. Because a negative times negative is positive, and a positive times positive is positive. So what happens there is you run into a little bit of a problem right there. That's where you get stuck. You get stuck because of the square root of negative 44, and that is a non-real solution. Okay, and eventually we'll get into that in a little more detail about what that would mean. Okay, so since the quadratic formula involves a square root, sometimes there is no real number solution. So when solving ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, okay, just like we did up here, we get a non-real number solution when what? Well, the issue came when we did the square root of b squared minus 4ac. If that's a negative number or less than 0, we have a problem. So if b squared minus 4ac is less than 0, then we're going to get a non-real solution for our quadratic equation. Now, I don't expect you to know this, but the b squared minus 4ac, that's actually called the discriminant. So if an instructor ever uses that term, that's what they're referring to as the discriminant, is b squared minus 4ac. And the reason that it's important for us is that that square root of b squared minus 4ac in the quadratic formula, that's what tells us what kind of answer we're going to get. Okay, so that is using the quadratic formula when you get different types of answers.